Marcus Chen had built his empire from nothing. At 38, he owned the largest construction firm in the Pacific Northwest, and he never let anyone forget it. His office occupied the top floor of the building he designed himself, all glass and steel, overlooking the Seattle skyline. He knew every blueprint, every contract, every number down to the last decimal. What he didn't know was that everything was about to change because of a woman he barely noticed. She arrived on a Monday morning in March, wearing faded jeans and a hoodie that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a worn backpack over one shoulder. Marcus watched from his office window as she crossed the parking lot, heading toward the labor entrance. Another day worker, he assumed. The site foreman hired dozens of them throughout the year. They came and went like the rain. Her name was Elena Reyes, according to the paperwork that eventually crossed his desk. She'd signed on as general labor, the lowest position in the company. Marcus saw her badge photo clipped to a request for site access. She looked directly at the camera with dark, steady eyes that seemed too calm, too focused for someone applying for minimum wage work. He dismissed the thought. Probably another college dropout trying to make rent. Over the following weeks, Marcus noticed her in passing. She was always early, always the last to leave. While other workers clustered during breaks, smoking and scrolling through their phones, Elena studied the construction plans posted in the break room. He watched her once through the security cameras, tracing her finger along the structural diagrams with an intensity that struck him as odd. When the foreman walked by, she quickly moved away, grabbing her hard hat and returning to hauling materials. The site was massive, a 12-story mixed-use development that would transform the waterfront district. It was Marcus's most ambitious project, the one that would cement his legacy. He'd personally overseen every detail, fought the city council for permits, negotiated with investors who thought he was insane. The building was set to open in 6 months, and he was ahead of schedule. Everything was perfect. Then came the inspection report. The city structural engineer had found discrepancies in the foundation work on the eastern support columns. Nothing major, the report said, but it needed review. Marcus stormed through the site that afternoon, his project manager trailing behind him with excuses. They'd followed the plans exactly. The concrete had been poured according to specifications. The rebar placement was textbook perfect. Then why is the city saying there's a problem? Marcus demanded, his voice echoing across the construction floor. Workers nearby pretended not to listen, but he could feel their attention. He hated appearing uncertain in front of the crew. That evening, as the sun set behind the Olympic Mountains, Marcus sat alone in the half-finished lobby, reviewing the structural plans for the 100th time. The numbers didn't lie. Everything was correct. The inspector had to be wrong, but proving it would delay the project, cost him money, damage his reputation. He was so absorbed in the blueprints that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching. The problem isn't the foundation. The voice was quiet but clear, with a slight accent he couldn't quite place. Marcus looked up sharply. Elena stood 10 feet away, still wearing her work clothes, dirt smudged across one cheek. She held a rolled set of plans under her arm. "Excuse me?" Marcus's tone could have frozen water. Who did this worker think she was, approaching him uninvited? "The eastern columns," Elena continued, seeming unbothered by his glare. "The inspector is looking at the wrong issue. The foundation is fine. But the load calculations for the upper floors are going to create lateral stress that the current design can't handle. Especially during seismic activity." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "When the big earthquake comes, and it will come, this building will fold like a house of cards." Marcus stood slowly, anger building in his chest. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I designed this building. I've been in this industry for 15 years. And you're a day laborer who's been here for 3 weeks. He stepped closer, using his height to intimidate. "Get back to work, or get out." Elena didn't move. She simply unrolled the plans she was carrying, spreading them across a stack of drywall. They were copies of his original designs, but covered in notes, calculations, and corrections written in precise, tiny handwriting. "I'm not questioning your experience, Mr. Chen. I'm trying to save lives. Including yours." Marcus stared at the annotated plans spread before him, his mind racing between outrage and curiosity. The calculations were complex, using advanced structural engineering formulas that no ordinary laborer should even recognize, let alone understand. He spotted differential equations, finite element analysis notations, and seismic load assessments that belonged in a graduate-level engineering textbook. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, though his voice had lost some of its edge. He leaned closer despite himself, trying to decipher her handwriting in the dim construction lighting. Elena pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and aimed it at the plans. I made them. Every night for the past 2 weeks, I've been running the numbers. Your building is beautiful, Mr. Chen. The design is elegant, efficient. But Seattle sits on a subduction zone. The Cascadia fault line is overdue for a major event, probably a magnitude 9 or higher. When that happens, this building needs to move with the ground, not against it. I know about the Cascadia zone, Marcus snapped. Every building in this city is designed to code, including earthquake resistance. We exceed the standards. The current standards, yes. Elena's finger traced a series of calculations along the margin. But the standards were written based on the last major earthquake data we have, which is over 300 years old. The geological surveys from the past 5 years suggest the next event will be significantly more powerful than the models predict. Your building meets yesterday's requirements. It won't survive tomorrow's reality. Marcus wanted to dismiss her, to call security and have her escorted off the property. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the confidence in her voice, or the precision of her mathematics, or the simple fact that she'd risked her job to confront him. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight function, illuminating a section of her calculations. Show me, he said curtly. Prove it. For the next hour, Elena walked him through her analysis. She explained how the building's height-to-base ratio created a vulnerability point at the 7th floor, where the structure transitioned from commercial to residential use. She demonstrated how the current dampening system would fail under sustained lateral movement exceeding 0.75 g-force, a threshold the next major earthquake would easily surpass. She showed him computer modeling results she'd run on public seismology databases, overlaying his building specifications with projected ground motion. Marcus listened, his engineering background allowing him to follow her logic even as his ego resisted it. She was right. God help him, she was completely right. The building would survive a moderate earthquake, maybe even a strong one. But a great subduction zone event, the kind that hit every 300 to 500 years, would create forces his design hadn't fully accounted for. The eastern columns would hold initially, then fail progressively as the shaking continued, leading to a catastrophic partial collapse. Who are you? Marcus finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. And don't tell me you're just a de labor. Elena rolled up the plans carefully, her movements precise and controlled. I'm someone who needed a job and wanted to understand how buildings die. My real name is Dr. Elena Reyes. I have a doctorate in structural engineering from MIT and a master's in seismology from Caltech. I've published 4 papers on earthquake-resistant design in high-rise construction. And 6 months ago, I was fired from the Steinberg Group for refusing to sign off on a project I knew was unsafe. Marcus felt his world tilting. The Steinberg Group was his biggest competitor, a firm with offices in 15 countries and a reputation for cutting-edge design. You worked for Steinberg? I was their lead structural engineer for the West Coast Division, Elena said quietly. Until I told them their new San Francisco tower had the same vulnerability I found in your building. They buried my report, called me an alarmist, and escorted me out the same day. They are breaking ground next month. When the earthquake comes, hundreds of people will die. She met his eyes, and he saw pain there, deep and raw. I couldn't stop them. But maybe I can stop it from happening here. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, his mind spinning. Why didn't you just come to me directly? Why get hired as a labor? Because men like you don't listen to warnings from strangers, especially women. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact, without bitterness. You would have dismissed me as a competitor trying to sabotage your project, or a conspiracy theorist, or just another person who didn't understand your vision. I needed to see the building from the inside, verify my concerns, and have proof before approaching you. And I needed you to be alone, away from your lawyers and project managers, so you might actually hear the truth. The construction site was silent around them, the only sound the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Marcus looked at his building, the skeleton of steel and concrete rising against the night sky, and felt something he rarely experienced, genuine fear. Not for his reputation or his profit margin, but for the families who would live here, the workers in the offices, the people walking the retail floors below. If this gets out, he said slowly, the investors will pull funding. The city might revoke permits. I could lose everything. If this doesn't get fixed, Elena replied, people will lose their lives. Marcus made his decision. Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., my office. Bring everything you have. We're going to redesign this building from the ground up. The conference room became a war room. Marcus cleared his schedule, telling his assistant to cancel everything for the next 72 hours. Elena arrived at dawn with 3 laptops, a portable server, and enough energy drinks to fuel a small army. Together, they spread out the building plans across the massive oak table, surrounding themselves with seismic data, stress analysis reports, and material specification sheets. Marcus's lead engineer, David Park, arrived at 7:30 and stopped dead in the doorway. "Who's this?" he asked, staring at Elena with obvious confusion. He'd seen her on the construction site, hauling rebar and mixing concrete. "This is Dr. Elena Reyes," Marcus said without looking up from a set of calculations. "She's going to save this project. Sit down and listen." For the next 6 hours, Elena presented her findings to the engineering team Marcus assembled. She showed them the seismic projections, the load analysis failures, the progressive collapse scenarios. Some of the engineers were skeptical at first, challenging her numbers, questioning her models. Elena responded to each objection with data, with peer-reviewed studies, with mathematical proofs that were impossible to refute. David was the hardest to convince. He'd worked with Marcus for 10 years, designed half the building systems himself. "Even if you're right," he argued, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, "we're 6 months from completion. Redesigning the structural support system now would require demolishing everything above the 4th floor. We'd lose 18 months and $40 million. The investors would sue us into oblivion." "The investors would rather be sued than be responsible for deaths," Elena shot back. "And we don't need to demolish everything. We can reinforce the existing structure with a hybrid damping system, install supplemental shear walls in the elevator cores, and add base isolation retrofits to the foundation. It's not ideal, but it's achievable within your timeline." Marcus watched the exchange with a strange mixture of admiration and anxiety. Elena was brilliant, there was no question. But David was right about the financial reality. Marcus pulled up the project budget on his tablet, running quick calculations. The modifications Elena proposed would cost at least $12 million, maybe 15. His profit margin would evaporate. He might actually lose money on the entire development. His phone buzzed with a text from his lead investor, Richard Thornton. "Heard you pulled the team off schedule. What's going on? Call me." Marcus ignored it. Then another text, this one more insistent. "City inspector is asking questions. Need answers. Now." "We have a bigger problem," Marcus announced, silencing the debate. "The city knows something's wrong. If we admit to structural issues now, they'll shut us down pending a full investigation. That's not 18 months of delay, that's potentially years. And if Thornton and the other investors think we've been hiding safety concerns, they'll bury us in litigation." Elena stood and walked to the window, looking down at the construction site below. Workers moved like ants across the steel framework, trusting that the building they were constructing would stand forever. "Then we need to be smart about this," she said quietly. "We don't report problems. We report improvements. We tell the city we're implementing advanced seismic safety features that exceed code requirements. We make it sound like innovation, not correction." "That's deceptive," David protested. "That's survival," Marcus countered. He looked at Elena, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She wasn't just trying to be right. She was trying to navigate the impossible space between what was true and what was politically viable. "Can you make it work? Can you give me a presentation that sells this as a voluntary upgrade?" Elena turned from the window, and Marcus saw exhaustion in her eyes. She'd probably been running on adrenaline and caffeine for days. "I can make it work. But you need to commit fully. No half measures, no cutting corners to save money. Either we do this right, or people die. Those are the only 2 options." Marcus stood and extended his hand across the table. "We do it right. Whatever it costs." They shook hands, and Marcus felt the calluses on her palm, earned from weeks of manual labor she never should have needed to do. Then the real work began. Elena broke the engineering team into groups, assigning each a specific component of the redesign. Marcus worked the political angle, crafting carefully worded communications to the city and the investors. He described the changes as enhanced seismic resilience features and next-generation safety systems, technically true but designed to avoid raising alarm bells. The 72 hours stretched into 96, then 120. The team worked through nights, surviving on takeout food and increasingly desperate caffeine consumption. Elena proved to be not just brilliant but relentless, catching errors in calculations that would have caused problems months down the line, pushing the engineers to think beyond conventional solutions. On the 4th night, Marcus found her alone in the conference room at 2 a.m., staring at a computer model of the building under simulated earthquake conditions. The animation showed the structure swaying, the dampening systems absorbing energy, the reinforced columns holding firm even as the ground buckled and heaved beneath them. "It'll work," she said without looking at him. "The building will survive. People will be safe." Marcus sat down beside her, feeling the weight of 4 days without real sleep. "Why did you really do this? You could have just walked away, found another job, let this be someone else's problem." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "My father was a construction worker in Mexico City. He died in the 1985 earthquake when a poorly designed building collapsed. I was 6 years old. I became an engineer so I could prevent what happened to him from happening to others. At Steinberg, I failed. I wasn't going to fail again." Marcus thought about his own motivations, his drive for success and recognition, his need to be the best. Sitting next to someone who'd sacrificed everything for a principle made his ambitions feel hollow. "I'm sorry," he said. "About your father. And about not listening sooner. You're listening now. That's what matters." The city inspection happened on day 6. Marcus presented the enhanced safety features with Elena standing beside him, introduced now as his consulting structural engineer. The inspector reviewed the plans, asked pointed questions that Elena answered with calm expertise, and finally signed off on the modifications. The investors were harder to convince, but Marcus leveraged his reputation and the positive publicity around the safety upgrades to keep them from revolting. Construction resumed with new specifications. The cost overruns were painful, but Marcus absorbed them personally, reducing his own compensation to keep the project viable. Elena moved from the construction site to a proper office, leading the structural team through the implementation phase. Slowly, over weeks and months, the building transformed into something stronger, something that could withstand the unthinkable. But the real storm was still coming. 5 months later, the building was nearly complete. The retail spaces on the ground floors were being fitted with fixtures, the residential units were in final finishing stages, and the office floors gleamed with new carpet and fresh paint. Marcus stood in what would soon be the lobby cafe, watching workers install the last pieces of decorative tile, when his phone buzzed with an alert he'd been dreading for months. USGS earthquake notification, magnitude 5.2 event detected off Vancouver Island. Possible foreshock activity. Monitor for updates. Elena appeared at his elbow, having received the same alert. "It's starting," she said quietly. The Pacific Northwest had been experiencing increased seismic activity for 3 weeks. Small tremors, nothing above magnitude 4, but occurring with unusual frequency. Geologists were divided on what it meant. Some called it normal variance. Others whispered about the Cascadia subduction zone waking up after 3 centuries of sleep. "This could be nothing," Marcus said, trying to convince himself as much as her. "We've had foreshocks before that didn't lead anywhere." "We've also had foreshocks that preceded every major earthquake in recorded history," Elena countered. She pulled out her tablet, connecting to the seismology network she monitored obsessively. "The pattern is concerning. The tremors are following the fault line northward, releasing stress in segments. That's exactly what we'd expect to see before a major rupture event." Over the next week, the tremors continued. A magnitude 5.8 near Portland. A 6.1 off the coast of Eureka. The media started paying attention, running segments about earthquake preparedness, interviewing scientists who gave carefully non-committal answers designed not to cause panic. Marcus noticed people in Seattle looking up at buildings with new suspicion, wondering if the structures they'd trusted their entire lives would hold when the ground betrayed them. The building passed its final inspection on a Thursday morning. The certificate of occupancy was signed, the investors were celebrating, and the first residential tenants were scheduled to move in the following Monday. Marcus should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt terrified. That night, he and Elena had dinner at a small restaurant on Capitol Hill. They'd become friends over the past months, their relationship evolving from antagonistic to collaborative to something neither of them quite knew how to define. She'd saved his project and possibly his soul. He'd given her a second chance to do the work she believed in. Between them lay an understanding that went beyond words. "If the big one hits before people move in," Marcus said, pushing pasta around his plate, "at least the building will be empty." "If the big one hits after people move in," Elena replied, "they'll survive because we did the work right." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Stop looking for reasons to feel guilty. You made the right choice. Not every developer would have." Marcus wanted to believe her. But he'd spent his entire career building structures designed to last decades, and now he was being forced to confront the reality that everything was temporary, everything was vulnerable, and all human creation existed at the mercy of forces beyond control. The earthquake struck at 2:47 a.m. on Saturday morning. Marcus was asleep in his downtown apartment when the shaking started. At first, it felt like a truck passing outside, a low rumble that rattled the windows. Then the building lurched sideways, and he was thrown from his bed, crashing against the nightstand. Glass shattered somewhere in the darkness. The emergency lights flickered on as the power failed, casting everything in eerie red illumination. The shaking intensified. Marcus crawled toward the doorway, the approved safety position, and braced himself as the building swayed. He could hear the structure groaning, the steel frame flexing, the concrete walls absorbing stresses they were never meant to endure. His apartment was in an older building, constructed in the 1970s, before modern seismic codes. He'd never bothered to check its earthquake rating. Now he wondered if he'd survive long enough to regret that oversight. The main shock lasted 90 seconds, though it felt like hours. When the shaking finally subsided, Marcus lay in the doorway, breathing hard, listening to car alarms and emergency sirens filling the night air. His phone was on the floor nearby, cracked but still functional. He grabbed it with shaking hands and pulled up the USGS data. Magnitude 8.9. Epicenter 70 miles offshore. Depth, 30 kilometers. The Cascadia subduction zone had finally ruptured. Marcus's first thought was of his building. His second thought was of Elena. He tried calling her, but the cellular network was overloaded. Text messages weren't going through. He pulled on clothes in the darkness, grabbed his emergency kit, and made his way down the stairs, joining other residents fleeing the building. Outside, Seattle was transformed. Buildings leaned at odd angles. Windows had shattered across entire blocks. The streets were cracked and buckled, with water fountains erupting from broken mains. People wandered in shock, some bleeding, others simply staring at the destruction with expressions of disbelief. In the distance, Marcus could see smoke rising from fires that were already beginning to spread. He ran toward the waterfront, toward his building, dodging debris and down power lines. Emergency vehicles screamed past, heading toward the worst of the damage. A police officer tried to stop him, shouting that the area was being evacuated, but Marcus pushed past. He had to know. He had to see. When he finally reached the development site, he stopped and stared. The building stood. Around it, older structures had collapsed or sustained catastrophic damage. A parking garage across the street had pancaked, its floors compressed into a twisted pile of concrete and steel. The historic building next door had lost its entire brick facade, revealing the skeletal framework beneath. But Marcus's building, the one Elena had forced him to fix, rose intact against the dawn sky. The windows were unbroken. The walls showed no cracks. The structure stood exactly as designed, having moved with the earthquake rather than resisting it, the dampening systems and reinforced columns performing exactly as Elena's calculations had predicted. Marcus fell to his knees on the broken sidewalk and wept. The sun rose over a changed city. Seattle's skyline was broken, with dozens of buildings damaged beyond repair. The death toll was still being calculated, but early reports suggested hundreds dead, thousands injured. The earthquake had triggered fires that overwhelmed the emergency services, and entire neighborhoods were being evacuated as gas leaks threatened further explosions. The disaster that seismologists had warned about for decades had finally arrived. Marcus spent the first hours after dawn helping rescue workers pull survivors from collapsed buildings. His construction expertise proved invaluable in assessing which structures were stable enough to enter and which needed to be avoided. He worked alongside firefighters and paramedics, his expensive suit torn and covered in dust, no longer the polished developer but simply another person trying to help. At noon, he finally found Elena. She was at the emergency command center set up in a parking lot, working with city engineers to assess structural damage across downtown. When she saw him, she broke into a run, throwing her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "I thought you might be dead," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Your building, the old one where you lived." "Partial collapse on the west side," Marcus confirmed. "I got out. A lot of people didn't." He pulled back to look at her. She had a cut above her eyebrow and bruises on her arms, but she was alive. "Our building? Come see for yourself." They walked through devastated streets to the waterfront development. In daylight, the contrast was even more striking. The building Marcus and Elena had fought to redesign stood undamaged while destruction surrounded it on all sides. Emergency workers had established a triage center in the lobby, using the structure's stability to treat injured people who couldn't be transported to overwhelmed hospitals. Inside, the building hummed with activity. The backup generators had kicked in automatically, providing power when the grid failed. The water systems were intact. The structural integrity was holding perfectly. Marcus walked through the ground floor, seeing his design serving a purpose he'd never imagined, not as a monument to his ambition, but as a refuge in the midst of catastrophe. The residential tenants were supposed to move in Monday, Elena said softly, standing beside him as they watched paramedics work. If this had happened a week later, there would have been families here. Children. Instead, we're saving lives because the building is empty and strong enough to serve as an emergency shelter. Marcus thought about the cost overruns he'd absorbed, the stress he'd endured, the fights with investors who thought he was wasting money on unnecessary safety features. All of it seemed meaningless now. How many other buildings in the city used your design recommendations? He asked. Elena's expression darkened. 3. Out of hundreds under construction. I tried to reach out to other developers, other firms. Most ignored me. Some sent cease and desist letters, threatening to sue if I spread panic about their projects. She gestured toward the window, toward the broken skyline. The Steinberg building in San Francisco, the one I tried to warn them about? It collapsed. 23 stories pancaked during the shaking. They're still counting the bodies. Marcus felt rage and grief warring in his chest. 23 stories of people who trusted that someone else had done the work to keep them safe. They murdered those people, he said quietly. They prioritized profit over safety, Elena corrected, though her voice was hard. In our industry, that's legal. That's normal. That's how most buildings get made. She turned to face him fully. You were different. When presented with truth you didn't want to hear, you listened. You sacrificed profit for principle. That's why this building stands and others fell. Over the following days, Marcus's building became a symbol of hope in a shattered city. The media ran stories about the miracle structure that survived when others failed. Engineers from around the world requested the design specifications. Marcus could have taken all the credit, could have positioned himself as a visionary who'd anticipated the disaster. Instead, he held a press conference and told the truth. I didn't save this building, he said, standing in front of cameras with Elena beside him. Dr. Elena Reyes did. She identified the flaws in my original design, she calculated the necessary corrections, and she fought to implement them even when I resisted. Every person who finds shelter in this building today owes their safety to her expertise and her courage. And every building that failed, every life lost in those collapses, happened because other developers didn't listen to warnings from experts like her. The press conference made national news. Within hours, Elena's phone was ringing constantly with job offers, speaking requests, consulting opportunities. The industry that had blacklisted her 6 months earlier now wanted to claim her as their own. She declined most of the offers, focusing instead on working with the city to assess damage and plan reconstruction. Marcus spent his days doing the same work, but his nights were different. He sat in his temporary housing, reviewing the plans for his next project, a residential tower already approved and funded. He looked at the beautiful renderings, the efficient floor plans, the projected profit margins. Then he thought about Elena's father, crushed in a building that someone had designed without considering the unthinkable. He called an emergency meeting with his engineering team. We're redesigning from scratch, he announced. Every project we have in development, every building we've planned. We apply Dr. Reyes's seismic safety standards to all of them. I don't care about the cost. I don't care about the delays. We build structures that protect lives, or we don't build at all. David Park, who'd been skeptical of Elena from the start, nodded slowly. The industry is going to follow our lead, he said. After this earthquake, after seeing what worked and what failed, everyone will want to build like we do. We could write new standards. That's exactly what we're going to do, Marcus confirmed. He looked at Elena, who sat at the far end of the table with a slight smile on her face. With Dr. Reyes as our lead structural engineer and partner. Equal stake in the firm, equal say in every decision. Elena's smile widened. I have one condition. Name it. We establish a foundation to provide free seismic assessments and retrofit designs for existing buildings, especially in low-income areas. The people who can't afford fancy new construction deserve safe structures too. We use our profits to protect everyone, not just the wealthy. Marcus extended his hand across the table. Deal. 6 months later, Seattle was rebuilding. The scars remained visible, empty lots where buildings once stood, memorials to those who died. But the reconstruction followed new standards, informed by the lessons learned from catastrophe. Marcus's firm led the effort, with Elena as its public face and moral compass. The waterfront development finally opened to residents, with a plaque in the lobby dedicating the building to Elena's father and all those who died in earthquakes around the world. Families moved into apartments they trusted would protect them. Businesses opened in commercial spaces built to endure the unthinkable. Marcus stood in the lobby on opening day, watching children play near the indoor fountain while their parents signed lease agreements. Elena stood beside him, wearing a professional suit now instead of construction gear, her hair down instead of pulled back. They'd built something together that was more than steel and concrete. They'd built proof that doing the right thing, even when difficult, was always possible. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. "For not giving up on me. For making me better." Elena took his hand, interlacing their fingers. "You made yourself better. I just showed you what was possible." She looked up at the building rising above them, solid and strong and safe. "We both did what we needed to do. You thought I was just a worker. Turns out, I was exactly what you needed." Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses that remained from her weeks in disguise. "And what are you now?" "Your partner," Elena said simply. "In every sense that matters." Outside, the city continued its slow healing. But inside the building that had survived when others fell, two people who'd found each other in crisis stood together, ready to build a future that honored the past and protected those yet to come. The storm had tested them both, and they'd proven strong enough to weather it. The real work, they both knew, was just beginning.